My name is Bob Liff, and this is the CUNY Forum, a town meeting that brings prominent New Yorkers together with faculty and students of the Edward T. Rogowsky Internship Program in Government and Public Affairs. When I went to Brooklyn College in the late 1960s, we couldn't vote. The voting age was 21. But with the war in Vietnam carrying the threat we could be drafted, at least the men among us, and with the civil rights movement in full flower and the women's movement emerging into the mainstream, it was a distinctly political time. And as I look back a half a century, there were certain things that were very clear at that time. I knew everything. There was no room for doubt. Even if we could vote, voting for the lesser of two evils seemed like a fool's errand, since each was still evil. Now I know I knew nothing. It's hard to argue it made no difference whether Hubert Humphrey or Richard Nixon was elected in 1968, just that it is impossible to argue it made no difference whether Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump won in 2016, or if Joe Biden or Donald Trump win this year. That applies as well to elections lower on the ballot, which actually have a more direct impact on voters choosing candidates this year for Congress and in New York, the state legislature. And it is CUNY students entering their adulthood who will live with the impacts of those choices. We're joined by four people to talk about how and why young people can address those choices, including whether to get involved in electoral politics or withhold participation to make a political point. Salimatu Doumbouya is a senior at CUNY's New York City College of Technology, where is the Student Government Association president, and also serves as the student representative on CUNY's Board of Trustees. Tim Hunter, the press secretary for the New York City Campaign Finance Board, was one of Salimatu's student predecessors on the CUNY Board of Trustees and was a youth ambassador, urging young people to vote while a student at City Tech. He is now a graduate student at Baruch. Bryce Bennett is the executive director of Vote Early Day, which is helping voters, especially young voters, adjust to the chance to vote in the weeks before Election Day in the face of efforts by some, meaning Republicans around Donald Trump, to limit voting by casting doubt on early voting. Zalima Blair chairs the Department of Public Administration at CUNY's Medgar Evers College, where redistricting research director, following in the footsteps of the late and deeply missed John Flatteau. Let me start with you, Salimatu. You sit on the CUNY Board of Directors. You move around various campuses. Are CUNY students politically engaged? Are they politically aware? There's a lot of countervailing forces.
CUNY students are politically engaged and politically aware when they understand the stakes and when they understand the policies that are at stake. At the board level, we also deal with policies. Locally on our campuses, we also deal with some kind of politics. And due to that, I have noticed with my colleagues on University Student Senate that the moment they get the information, the moment they understand what's on the table, they start to care. And when they start to care, they show up and they do what they need to do. But I've also noticed that students do not vote necessarily for an individual, they vote for the program. They vote for the policies that will benefit them at that particular moment, but also long term.
Tim, what do young voting ambassadors do? I mean, you did that when you were at City Tech, is that correct?
Yeah, when I was at City Tech, I served as a New York City Youth Votes ambassador. I spent a lot of time researching voting trends among young people and also raising awareness around the upcoming 2020 election cycle. So it's been 4 years since I've been a youth ambassador, and now I work as the press secretary for the New York City Campaign Finance Board. So we publish a lot of reports and research on voting trends among especially young voters. From 2016 to 2020, we saw a 3.4% increase in youth voters between ages 18 to 29, voting in the presidential elections for that year. And I think we should expect somewhat of a similar willingness to go to the polls, as now, we have almost 40 million Gen Z voters that could be potential voters in this upcoming election. Additional 8 million, on top of that includes the 8 million voters that just became eligible to vote as of 2022. So I think that, there's a lot of energy, but as Salimatu said, it's important to, make sure that that energy is focused on the programs and what is going to drive those young people to the polls, hopefully in April, now, in June, and in November.
June is the congressional and legislative primaries in New York State. Bryce, you travel around the country. Is what you're hearing that students are more engaged? And there was an obvious uptick in voting turnout. Frankly, I think surrounding in opposition to President Trump. Are you seeing that same kind of uptick in participation?
We're seeing unprecedented participation by young people. You know, at Vote Early Day, we have thousands of campus partners all across the nation, and they're some of the most active groups that we have. You know, people are very eager to talk to their friends and neighbors and classmates about what's on the line this year. And no matter who you're voting for, people are excited to share their voices. I mean, obviously, we're seeing some of the same news that everyone else is about some of the challenges that come with apathy. But when it comes to young people, when it comes to peers, talking to peers and encouraging their friends to cast their ballots, we're seeing a big uptick and a big uprising and making sure that nobody is left behind this year.
Zulema, Medgar Evers in particular has a long history of political activism. Are you seeing that? I mean, are students, you know, in particular the war in Gaza has kind of driven a wedge into the Democratic Party, just the way some of Trump's antics has driven a wedge into the Republican Party. Are you seeing an openness?
What I see is that when students are being educated about certain issues, they come to the table. I chair a lecture series in addition to the department, the Dr. Una S.T. Clark Women in Government Lecture Series. And we have many people that come to the table, from Yvette Clark, Ewen Chu, a number of individuals, Rita Joseph, and they come and they educate the students about
These are
what's going on.
elected officials who are actually also CUNY graduates.
And so when, exactly. So when they can self-identify with these individuals who are right in their neighborhoods and who are telling them, hey, here's what's on, here are the issues of the day, here are the public policy issues, the students are engaged. But how do you get them engaged? Someone literally has to come and bring them the information. And so we need more of that going on at campus. You need that co-curricular sort of roadmap to steer the students that way.
You know, we have a number of fairly serious third-party candidates floating out there. Bobby Kennedy Jr., Jill Stein on the Green Party, who arguably could have affected, her vote in Wisconsin in particular could have flipped that state to Trump. You have Cornel West, who's kind of probably making the hardest left appeal among the independent candidates. One of the arguments is that ultimately we have a zero-sum game in elections, that it's a two-party contest in terms of who's going to win. When you talk about students more interested in the programmatic than the party aspects of voting, how does that factor in?
That factor in terms of education, like Professor was talking about, students need to be educated about the programs of the different candidates and what's at stake, and they would vote according to that. I'm finding that students don't necessarily relate to one party or the other because they come to the understanding on their own, which I've heard, that it's not really about the party, but it's about what the party is bringing to the table at that particular moment. We're seeing shifts of young people coming from one place to the other. Whatever was dominant before is not necessarily the dominant ideology in the youth today because there are different things that they are putting at the forefront of what they want to do. So that's what I mean.
Kind of same question. Do people understand that ultimately, in terms of who's going to win or lose, it's all but likely it's either going to be the Democratic nominee or the Republican nominee? People analyze third parties in terms of who takes more from who, in terms of when you have such a closely divided electorate.
Yeah,
that becomes determinative.
I agree, and I think this election is unlike other elections due to not only the interest in third-party candidates, but also the numerous crises that we're experiencing that you mentioned earlier. I mean, we saw what happened in other states with a lot of voters deciding to cast their ballot as uncommitted or not showing a preference in a specific candidate, and that's a phenomenon that's playing out across the country, not just in a few states. There are a number of groups that are unhappy with only choosing between these two candidates. I think that, coupled with a strong appeal to third-party candidates, such as the candidates that you mentioned, could spell as a disaster for the two-party establishments that are trying to, coalesce and bring people together in a time where, we have an election that's very important. I think the last thing that I'll highlight, in addition to, having these options, Salamatu and Professor Blair already highlighted multiple times that education is so important in this. And I think, a lot of issues that we're seeing, people think it's registration that's a big issue. In New York, 4 in 5 New Yorkers are already registered to vote. The issue is getting them out, also getting them out to primaries and getting them out in off-year election cycles. And I think that it's important to also expand access as much as it is that we're expanding options at the poll.
Bryce, there's, especially in a media environment where people are, because of the technological change, people tend to watch their own ideological silo. When I grew up in New York, we had 7 papers, and they were ideologically different, but they all agreed on the same facts, and then they could fight about it.
Sure.
Now you have a stratified media environment and a stratified online social media environment where people are living in their silos. There's not that kind of cross-fertilization. So, when you talk to people, do they understand the role of parties?
Well, I think it really does come to the education piece that we talked about before that so many people have highlighted here, because it really goes beyond this expectation of who are the people that are supposed to be educating folks about these elections. And one of the big things that we do at Vote Early Day is bring together partners from all walks of life, not just the television companies, not just the campaigns, not just the standard people that you expect to see election information from, but businesses, nonprofits, campus groups, media companies, election officials, people that can meet people where they are with that information. Because there was a study that came out not too long ago that said, they talked with young people about why is it that you didn't turn out in the last election? And the number one reason was, I didn't know how. So just that basic education, even beyond the issues, people were saying, I don't know how to cast a ballot. I don't know how to go about this process. And the second piece that I really think goes to what I've been speaking about here is people said, nobody asked me to. And I think that really speaks to the fact that we all have an obligation in this work to be an advocate for our friends and neighbors and not just assume that everybody has that covered, because we can all play an important role in making sure that people turn out and not just expecting the standard messengers to do the work.
Drawing on my own Brooklyn College experience at the anti-war movement, that we were rejecting everything. We were in full revolt, and looking back, I think we paid, not so much we paid, but the people the people that we professed to be concerned about, poorer people, working people, who are more directly impacted by that choice. And and I would make an argument, this is my own partisan politics, that Democrats compared to Republicans are better for those people. But younger people find it harder to see that.
Right. So in Brooklyn, since you brought up Brooklyn College, so in Brooklyn, when you're getting people out to vote or you're asking people, will you vote for me? One of the things that happens is households sometimes go to the polls together. And so the parents tell the kids, vote Democrat or vote Republican, et cetera. Or they tell the candidates that's knocking on their door, I have 4 or 5 people in my household, we're all gonna vote for you, if they ask them to, right? And so I think that makes a difference, and it matters, the party politics there. You bring in the church and other civic organizations, nonprofit organizations, that adds to it with the democratic factor. And then for college students overall, why it matters about them turn out to vote. If you look at the federal government, they look to the federal government to get these tangible benefits, right? Financial aid, everyone knows it comes from FAFSA, comes from the federal government, at least to a certain extent, Pell Grants, et cetera. They're looking to them about all this housing crisis that we're in, and any other things that could trickle down to their local level. And the same thing at the state level. So that's what the federal government does. So low-income populations look to the federal government. So it matters. Then you have these congressional elections coming up. In Brooklyn, again, where we have this surge of African-American candidates leading the way in terms of citywide and national politics and statewide government, it fuels that interest. So I guess it matters who the candidate is, and if they see this push towards President Biden and see this mobilization effort towards President Biden, I think it might make a difference there.
Might make an
Yeah.
incremental difference over
Yeah,
time,
yeah.
aiming towards that.
Yeah.
I was going to say one day of election, but then I would be
And-
upsetting Bryce. Not one day, but
Yeah,
The
and then,
last day to vote.
And then to add on to that, also the third-party candidates, because I don't want to leave that out. The third-party candidate, what the two-party system does is, you know, they eat up what the third-party platforms do, right? If it's the Green Party, if it's the Independent Party, they take on those issues, right? Remember, you had the marijuana party. They took on that issue and legalized marijuana. When you have anything conservatives use, they take that on and, you know, go pro-life. So it depends on how far to the right or to the left that they push the two parties.
building off of that, do you see people talk about people care about the you know, we're not a parliamentary system. You know, it's not like who you vote for, you know, will determine at least partial results for your particular party. Is there this sense of the duopoly that we have, the two-party structure, that people do people believe that it's useless to vote for anybody else except as a protest vote? And God knows we have the absolute right to cast protest votes. I'm not, you know, let's be clear. So I'm just trying to wrestle with the awareness, because when I was at Brooklyn College, you know, it was a luxury for us because we didn't think about the results, about the impact of you know, on the people we cared about as to who got elected, because we were so tied up in our own heads, being young and not having a great sense of history. I mean, does that play out on campuses across the country?
Well, I think the challenge that we have right now is that people haven't fully tuned in to the election. I think that those of us who are watching the news all the time are deeply aware of exactly where the candidates are, what they believe, what's on the line in this year. But as we talk to so many people on the ground who are not actively engaged in this work like we are, they're still sort of waking up to the fact that these primaries have been going on, that nominees are starting to be picked, and that we're going to have some big choices on our hand this fall. So I think that there's a lot of work that all of us have to do in the lead up to this election to make sure that, you know, again, focusing on that idea of education, not only of who the candidates are, where they stand, but making sure that people have really thoughtful ways of sharing their voices, because there are a number of barriers that can get in the way of people and their ability to cast a ballot, and we want to do everything we can to make sure that nobody's left behind.
So, we're basically talking about presidential politics. You know, again, in the current media environment, especially as a lot of local media has withered away, and we wind up with this, you know, with both social media and you know, more generalized media, very focused on a presidential election. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, they don't pay attention to congressional elections, legislative elections, the kind of work that, frankly, a lot of students at Medgar Evers do get involved in. Mm-hmm. Our students, you know, and they don't have to focus on this as obsessively as those of us who are political junkies do. But, I mean, do they think in terms of localized elections, or do you think they're focused mostly on what they see in the media and social media in terms of national?
I think that media is definitely dominating the landscape right now, mainstream media, but also social media, because that's where we get to express ourselves, and that's where people get to kind of control the narrative. But I also see it as an opportunity. The fact that mainstream media is taking the stage or dying down a little bit, and then social media is rising, it's an opportunity for the higher education institutions and the educational institutions to step up. Because if we're no longer listening to mainstream media, because some people may have a problem with it, and students are more inclined to share opinions on local politics or other things, then they come to school. Why not use these places as places where they get to learn more about politics, about what's going on? Now, in terms of are young people more interested in local politics or presidential elections, I would say it's on whatever the current climate tells them. What are they experiencing right now? What are the #1 issues? In our case, for example, as student advocates in the University Student Senate, our #1 priority right now is funding for CUNY. So the students who may not be too politically savvy, they care about the assembly. They care about the senators. This is what...
What does that mean? What does that caring translate into?
This caring translates to, okay, who is in charge right now? Are they running for elections again? What is the calendar? What is my role? Who represents me? And how I can affect these elections to make sure that we get what we deserve moving forward. So who is this person that represents me? How they affect me? What is that particular position? We really try to understand the pyramid. And from there, we decide what we get involved in and what we vote for. In terms of federal elections, it's really an interesting balance right now, because in terms, again, for CUNY students, for CUNY student advocates right now, that is not something we see as affecting the CUNY budget necessarily, right? That is an education that we did not focus on 100%. It may come up when we go to Washington, D.C. It may come up if CUNY educates us particularly, hey, this is how this affects us. Then our student advocates were like, okay, now this is something, this is a battle we want to get involved in. Now, regardless of all of this, we understand the importance of voting. We understand what's at stake. So we still do voter awareness campaigns. We still go on local campuses, tell them it's election year, you have to get out, we need to get out the vote. But again, in terms of circumstances, we would care, and I think students would be more aware if they saw firsthand how this affects us directly. You mentioned Gaza earlier. That is a reason why a lot of people want to pay attention to presidential elections, right? But that's young people in general, not necessarily people in CUNY, not necessarily people in schools, but because they are individuals who care about what's happening in the Middle East.
Right, but I'm just going to stay with this for 1 second, then I want to go to Tim. But, you know, in terms of opposition to both what Israel is doing in Gaza and to President Biden's weakening support, if you will, for Israel, if they vote on just that issue, if they reject Biden because of that issue, when you look at the entire range of issues that the next president is going to affect, does that, you know, God knows we're not downplaying that as an issue, but it seems to me it's harder for students to see that broader picture.
I understand that, but I also think we need to meet students where they are. I see it as the society, right? It is important. The youth vote is so important. And we may be at a place where everybody else thinks that the young people do not understand what's at stake. So what efforts are we doing to meet them there and make sure they understand more what's at stake? So how do we attract them to a particular issue? How do we bring them to the table and explain it to them? I think diplomacy may be a way to go here, a lot of education. But I'm also tempted to say, what vote is not a protest vote? Because when you're voting for one candidate, you basically decide that whatever this other candidate stands for is something that I cannot accept. We also have to consider why people vote and why they vote for one person or the other. Some people, especially young people, I would say, vote out of principle. They vote out of their beliefs. It could be religious beliefs, it could be their intrinsic values as human beings, it could be because of their background, because of their families. So if we break all of these things down, some people may be protest voting because of their religions, because of their values, because they support their neighbors, or just because of some belief that they have. But then maybe take into consideration other aspects of why they vote and educate them based on that.
Tim, you know, we're talking obviously about national elections. You know, we're taping this during the early voting period for the presidential primary, and this airs the day of the presidential primary. But then the action all shifts to the June primary.
Yeah.
And these kinds of, you know, these kinds of considerations Sally Matu's talking about on a national level are not necessarily the things that drive people when you get to local elections, when you get to city council elections, when you get to state assembly, state senate elections. Yeah. You know, we're even electing a United States senator this year.
Yeah. And
the congressional elections. So how do you, and there's a lot less awareness of candidates below, I always said that when I was a reporter, and I was a reporter in a city in Florida, which had one Congress member, we have 9.
Yeah.
In New York City.
Yeah.
So I mean, this, you can't get the kind of attention to a congressional election in a city that has one congressman is a lot bigger deal and a lot more attention than in a city where you have 9.
Yeah.
So how do you, and that's even exacerbated when it comes to the Senate and the Assembly, where you have, you know, dozens and dozens and dozens of seats that are up. How do you, how do young people break through that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's a really good question, Rob. And what I would kind of focus on too is you know, we talked a little bit earlier about what are some of those motivating factors for young voters and what brings young people to the polls. There's a separate poll that was done by Tufts recently that kind of said like right around 56 to 57% of young voters are ready, like are likely to vote in this upcoming election, which is
and that's high. Isn't
yeah,
it?
I would think that's a relatively on the higher number. I feel like voter registration turnout, if we're looking at New York City, you know, that was a national poll. You know, we were hovering right around the 50%, 60% mark in 2016 and in 2020. So I would say that that's a pretty good barometer for like average turnout. But we could be better, and we could always, you know, be much better as it relates to that. But I think it's also different when there are like other like issues that you're voting on, especially here locally this November in New York. You know, equality will literally be on the ballot. You know, the Equal Rights Amendment, you know, it passed 2 legislative sessions, you know, kind of enshrining, you know, a person's right to choose, you know, in our constitutional principles. So I would encourage anyone that is second guessing voting or feeling like they shouldn't turn up to the polls as a young person, you know, well, we have the most opportunity to have impact right now in this very moment. So why not act on it? You know, and instead of asking yourself why, you should be asking yourself, why am I not voting with all these different things that are on the line? And then just to talk a little bit about the importance of local voting as it relates to what's happening nationally. You know, Congress has failed to get a budget done. You know, it's actually going to hurt a lot of American families in the future if we can't get Congress to agree on some of their budget priorities for the upcoming year. And right now, the Republicans only hold a 1 seat, you know, because there was a recent resignation last week, a 1-seat majority in the House of Representatives. So, you know, these elections, especially after New York Republicans picked up, I think, maybe 4 congressional seats in 2022, this 2024 election cycle is going to determine the trajectory of our country. And I know every single election is important, but now more than ever, Gen Z voters, young voters, voters between 18 and 29, who have already shown interest in what's happening politically and that they can turn out, should turn out, because the future of our country depends on it.
I want to come to you about progressive politics, but I first want to ask you, Bryce, about this, you know, this point of awareness of local, non-presidential elections. You know, I mean, I think that the nationalization of politics has, and the segmentation of the media, the echo chamber quality. You know, if you watch MSNBC, you don't know what's being said on Fox and vice versa. You know, there's a cost to the civic, you know, to the civic presence in a city like New York, in a state. So, you know, because of this nationalization of politics. So is there a focus on local politics and the people you talk to?
Well, we have to. I mean, it's absolutely critical to focus on the local politics, because if you look at the national news, you might be surprised to learn that there's any other race in 2024 than the presidential race. I mean, that's always the conversation, when in fact there's going to be thousands of elections of local leaders at the state legislative level, at the county commission level, at the city level, and so many other spots. I mean, who are going to be passing laws and being able to implement policies that are going to affect the day-to-day lives of people in their local communities far more than anything that's going to happen from whoever is president of the United States. So especially in a world where we're seeing people say they're not overly excited, at this point at least, about the 2 major presidential candidates, it's very, very important, especially for those who are skeptical about politics, who are disaffected, who are uninterested in that race right now, to talk about what else is on the line, to make sure that people understand that their ballot has so much more. There's going to be so many things, including ballot initiatives in so many states across the country, that people are going to be deciding on that are going to have major impacts on their life, no matter who they're going to vote for when it comes to President of the United States.
A lot of the media coverage on a local level focuses, and because we are essentially a democratic city, and that a lot of the fights are happening between, for want of a better term, progressives as opposed to more moderate Democrats. Tim talked about the 4 congressional seats. While the rest of the country was going Democratic, we lost.
Right.
You know, we had 4 seats, and I would argue that the reason we lost those 4 seats was because of a reaction to one of the most important progressive. It was a reaction to bail reform, the perception that that wasn't holding people who are committing crimes appropriately accountable. You know, and arguably, if those voters had elected Democrats in those seats as opposed to Republicans, that you would see a whole different universe going on in Washington. I guess I'm trying to figure out to what degree, especially young people, can understand the value of compromise. I mean, it's a tough. I know I couldn't. I couldn't when I was that age, so I'm not pulling rank here.
I think people want what they want. It depends. Again, we're going to go back to education. If they understand what happens with bail reform, I think most young people are progressive, and I think when you
not all, but most.
I think, and so when you put it in that progressive state of mind, and when you hear it could happen to you, I think most people do go for it, especially with bail reform. Everyone's family member or a friend or someone can relate to the criminal justice system at some point in their lives, whether it's a friend, whether it's a cousin, whether it's someone, okay? And then we're talking about second chances here. When people see that they can get a second chance, most people are for that. But when you have now something like, live shootings in the train stations or something of that effect, what happens is the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. There's no medium.
Yes.
There's no public policy medium. And I think that's what makes people check out and say, I'm not going to pay attention to that. So if maybe some of the elected officials could compromise and voters see that, I think voters will follow suit because it's all about the messaging. When people message, you talked about CUNY, you only understand what's happening in the state legislature. We don't really get what's happening in the federal government. That's because there's someone driving a message. This is what we get from CUNY. So if the messaging is go against bail reform, go against the progressives, or sit out this election, that's what they do. When the president was driving the message, when the former president rather was driving the message about not coming up with a border policy, what did they do? They pulled back because it was who was driving the message. And so I think people forget that part about the messaging and how the issue is framed.
You know, I'm not arguing in favor or against bail reform. I'm trying to analyze the political impact that bail reform is very clear to me, especially on Long Island, because it's focused on New York City. And, you know, there's all kinds of racist underpinnings as to how that was, how that was portrayed and played out. I understand all that. But the political impact to me is pretty clear. And it resulted in Republicans winning when the rest of the country went very heavily Democrat. People you talk to, all of you, this idea of, a half a loaf feeds you a little bit as opposed to no loaf. I don't know how to, I'm not phrasing this very well, but, but you understand the point I'm making. This idea that you can't always get everything you want, but you take what you can get and you push the ball down the field a little bit.
Yeah, if I could.
Yes.
So we often speak of the electorate as a homogeneous population.
Oh, it's not, right?
We know that. And so people are voting along the lines of a lot of different things. They're voting along the lines of race. They're voting along the lines of party. They're voting along the lines of union. Class, educational attainment. And so those
and
are
also
the things.
Increasingly cultural issues, which is a whole new thing to come
and
to
again, religion and all these different things, right? So it's mostly about that. And then it's about peer influence as well, social capital. If individuals are, part of a club or part of student government, that's what they will do. They will band together and vote on those particular issues because the information that they receive, is easier to obtain that way.
Peer, in my real life, I actually work with a group that combats diabetes, and one of the things they do is they train people to lower their blood sugar, and then they train those people to train their neighbors. It's that peer-to-peer outreach, which is very successful. You're talking about peer-to-peer. I'm wrestling with how to express this idea of accepting half a loaf as opposed to, of pushing the ball down the field, even if you're not going to get it, even if you're not going to score a touchdown on every play. Again, I think of the clarity I had when I was in college and the muddled sense of clarity that I have now when I realize the give and take that goes on. I mean, the young people you talk to, can they embrace this? I don't know how to express this better. I'm sorry.
No, I think your point about the peer-to-peer connection is so incredibly vital, because there's so many of us who, like we said, the political junkies in the room, who I think is probably all of us here, who are watching the news, looking at all the different polls, very curious about everything that's happening this year. So when it comes to so many other folks who are more focused on, getting to work, paying for childcare, taking care of the bills, just getting by day to day, and politics is sort of this thing that sits on the side. There's people that are just not in this same lane as the rest of us, who are just like sucking in all this information, like it's from a big gulp. We really want to make sure in those situations that, like I mentioned before, that we're finding those opportunities to find the alternative messengers who are able to connect with those folks. I mean, that's like why we're so glad at Vote Early Day to partner with groups like the NBA or with MTV or with other groups out there that can meet people where they are, which I think is something we've all talked about today. With those messages that help people vote early, that make sure that people can share their voice, because they're not going to get it from the news, they're not going to get it from the door knock, because they probably are an infrequent voter, but they might get it from the favorite place that they go to watch their favorite sports team. And if that's the thing that does it, then that's enough.
It's interesting. I actually think that advertising has less and less impact, and that the peer, that the personal contact is far more powerful. Tell us your name and the campus and ask your question, please.
Hi, my name is Amani Woods, and I go to John Jay Community College. And my question is, do you think fundraising is more important, and why, for the campaign?
There's a huge focus on money in politics. And, the old saying, rich or poor, it's good to have money. That's what my 9th grade social studies teacher in East New York taught us. Money.
Yeah, if you have money in fundraising, that's the first thing a person asks. In New York City, endorsements are big, right? In any elections, endorsements are big. The first question that they ask you is, how much money do you have? How much money have you raised? And the reason why is that you can get your, message out. You can mail to voters, although we get mad when this floods our mailbox. You can make phone calls to vote. You can hire people on your campaign. You can distribute a lot more and reach a lot more voters if you have the money to do so.
One of the phenomena that we've seen is the election of Democratic Socialists of America, DSA candidates, in, mainly, frankly, in predominantly white, gentrified neighborhoods on a local level, for the state legislature, to some degree for the city council. They don't have a broader appeal. And when they ran in the South Bronx for a congressional seat, the DSA candidate came in 4th. That's less money than it is being intensely organized and be able to do that kind of outreach. So, money... I don't think that money is as much the mother's milk of politics as that kind of personal contact is.
Yeah, I would add, as someone that works in a campaign finance agency, we are responsible for auditing the millions of dollars that are raised, by city candidates, the mayor, the comptroller, the public advocate, and city council members. I think what you highlighted about the grassroots approach to organizing and fundraising that we've seen catapult a lot of young progressive leaders into positions of power, and some of them not being DSA candidates, like, Chiose,
right.
He's a council member who's,
right.
Also ran on a similar ideal. But also, I think it's the campaign financing structures that allow for that to occur. New York City has a very, nice matching funds program, or if you get $1 from an in-district, resident, that would be matched 1 to 8 with taxpayer dollars. The state is implementing a similar matching Funds Program, which I think should be making their first payment right
Yes.
before the upcoming June primaries. And you know, money in politics has undergone a lot of transformations, right? We could talk all afternoon about you know, some of the Supreme Court cases that have opened the floodgates, you know, to dark money spending.
Citizens United.
Yeah, but you know, it's important, you know, for local folks, especially at the local level, to be aware of some of the campaign finance rules and regulations that can maybe help your dollar go an extra way for
Well,
supporting a candidate.
you know, the campaign finance system in New York City has done more to level the playing field, that you do not need to raise the kind of money from special interests to kind of that dwarf the kind of money that a grassroots candidate would have access to. You know,
But it's also allowing you to reach voters. In order for you to gain that 1-to-6 return or that 6-to-1 return, you have to, you know, appeal or have donations for a certain number of voters. So already it's
Yes,
allowing
yes,
you to put
yes.
the work in
Yeah.
to communicate to those voters. And then when people see this, they donate more. I've seen it. I've been on the ground.
It's true.
Um,
The
so
last thing that I'll add, and I think what you're highlighting is very true, is that it's also important that candidates aren't spending their whole time fundraising, right? You know, because you don't want to become, you know, you don't want to have these allegiances to people that have so much money and want you to make bad decisions that might not help your community. So why matching funds programs and some of the other public finance operations across the country are great is because candidates can spend less time on the phone talking to donors, raising money from you know, billionaires or whatever, and they can spend more time working in their communities and you know, connecting with those donations, which are probably better and you know, more effective in helping a candidate you know, win.
yes, ma'am. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
My name is Andrea Duarte. I'm from Queens College. And I would like to ask, in an age of social media, how can we combat misinformation to make sure that voters are well informed once they get to the polls?
When you figure that out, please let us know. You know, misinformation it's always been misinformation, but it, you know, on the one hand, it's totally exacerbated by the anonymity and the ubiquity, if you will, of social media. On the other hand, it's particularly true of young voters who spend a lot of time on social media, but it's really smaller groups that spend a lot of time talking to each other as opposed to kind of the broader outreach. So, I mean, what do you think about it? I mean, you know, there is a lot of misinformation out there.
I think again that it is an opportunity. It is an opportunity again for education institutions to step up and play that role of educating the youth on what is the real information. I also think that it's a matter of how we define different things. When you're voting elections, it's a matter of making a decision on what's right for you and what's wrong for you. And it's a lot of, at some point, figuring out which milestone you're willing to reach. Am I about to compromise for a specific milestone, or do I want the whole package at once? And also, when I was talking about definitions, some people are not willing to compromise on what justice means. Just as an example, some people are not willing to compromise and call it a milestone, something that directly impacts their life here, right now. So when they see a piece of information, they don't second guess it. If this is true, this is affecting me directly. So no matter how much we tell them, yep, but part of this is not true, but part of this is true, and this affects me, and that's why I'm following this piece of information. So I think it is the institutions, the groups outside of social media that these young people are part of, if they're students, if they're part of different systems like a shelter or whatever groups they are part of in real life, I think should be educating them on the different issues and letting them know the real pieces of information that they need to know. And at the end of the day, they will make their own decisions on what they want to compromise on and what they say, I am not willing to risk 50% of my existence on this
You know,
issue.
Bryce, disinformation is at the core of the attack on early voting. And
Absolutely.
so, I mean, you know, I assume that you've been wrestling with this, you know, without being partisan in terms of the analysis, but the level of disinformation surrounding early voting is a good example of what I think this student was talking about.
Absolutely. I think that that's one of the most important questions of our time because it's a huge challenge that existed many years ago and is becoming more and more a problem the further we get into these elections. And certainly that's true when it comes to early voting, but it's true in general about our elections. And we've been doing a lot of education work and trying to educate ourselves about how we can help in this process. And obviously, there's a lot of work that we want every organization out there to do to try to not spread disinformation. But I think that each one of us has to play a role ourselves in making sure that we're not spreading that. Because I know that so often when you come across an Instagram post or something on X or some other place out there where you see this really provocative headline and you go, oh my God, I can't believe that. And you immediately want to share with all of your friends.
Right,
Making
but
sure that we're going to share information from reliable sources, especially when it comes to election information. There's a lot of, like the National Association of Secretaries of State out there, folks that really do their due diligence to make sure that their information is always going to be correct and is always going to be something that is widespread, that people can, share with their friends and neighbors with confidence, and making sure that, we're not buying into the clickbait that those who want to share disinformation are so eager to tempt us with.
Yes, sir. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
Holly Graham, Borough of Manhattan Community College. My question is, y'all focus on education, so how could education be used to bring more awareness to local elections for college campuses?
When a while ago, when I first got to McGovern College, one of the programs that we have run by Association of American State Colleges and Universities, ASCU, one of the things that we did was the American Democracy Project. I mean, the New York Times got involved, a lot of different, so again, going to the sponsors and the sponsorships. And I think campuses, college campuses, oftentimes, they don't think they do, but they have a duty to teach that this is their civic duty. They have a duty to show that, to engage in civic learning, civic engagement, and showing students that that's how it's supposed to be done, because it spills over. What you learn in college spills over into the community. And so if colleges are able to get that from the top and focus it on down, I think that that's the way to go. So education, colleges are supposed to do it, university presidents are supposed to do it. Hopefully the chancellor, he does it all the time, right? He puts all these different programs in place, internships, et cetera, and funds them because he knows that that makes a difference for students. So engaging, getting that information. And one of the things that need to happen, I think academically, is that there needs to be civic engagement across the curriculum, because people don't just go out and vote. It takes a while. There's steps to civic engagement and political participation. First, you have to be civically active, and then it crosses over to, yes, every year I'm going to go out and vote. Right now, people go out and vote every 4 years, every 2 years. They don't go out, they don't say every June or every November I'm going out to vote. So until it's ingrained in them, that's why the older you are, the more likely you are to vote, right? As opposed to as soon as I turn 18. I'm sorry. Right, because it has not been learned. This is a learned behavior. So yes, they have a duty to do it.
But more. Go ahead.
No, I just want to add to that because there's a great study out there that says, specifically to your point about people voting every 4 years, that with first-time voters, if they vote in their first 2 elections, it's very likely that they'll be lifetime voters. So you all are at the tip of the spear of making sure that people are lifetime voters by the advocacy that you do on these college campuses. And just the one thing that I would add to that, in addition to the work that campuses are doing to educate people about local elections, I think there's important work that the campaigns and the candidates and the parties and those pushing ballot initiatives need to do to meet students where they are by coming to these campuses. Because I know when I was in college, my campus was my world. You went out to other places, but the world you knew was what came to your campus. Right. So if they want your vote, if they want to be able to connect with you about the issues that matter to them, I think it's so imperative that they show up and make sure that they're being seen and have a chance to have those tough questions asked of them.
But you make the point. No one, we have about 6 minutes left. That civic consciousness, to the degree you measure it by increasing percentage of Gen Z in particular votes, seems to be growing.
Yeah, I would agree. It is definitely growing, and I think a lot of that is, you know, the exposure, social media, all these, you know, different avenues of getting information are definitely exposing younger people to, you know, what's happening outside of their world sometimes, whether it's their campus or their home or their community. I, you know, would also, you know, add to, in addition to all this, like building voting is a habit that needs to be built, as highlighted earlier. People that vote early tend to, you know, vote early more often later in future elections.
In Brooklyn, we always voted early and often, but go ahead.
Yeah, you know, early and often, you know, so we're seeing all these opportunities, you know, but I would also like to, like, you know, applaud CUNY for what they've done, you know, in voter access. You know, if you have CUNY First, you're a CUNY student, you can register to vote on CUNY First, you know, expanding access. You know, the state legislature has, you know, been a champion and a leader in doing that as well, especially with pre-registration. So even our college and students could, you know, get ready to vote before they can.
You can register as you get your driver's license.
Yeah, exactly. You can, at the DMV, you know, they always ask it to you in almost every form that you fill out. So I think just continuing to, you know, improve access, but I think including a civic engagement component in New York City high schools seems like a logical next step, you know, like targeting these voters earlier so we can build that habit earlier.
Yes, ma'am. Tell us your name and your campus, please.
Hi, my name is Cassandra Lebrun. I'm from CUNY SBS. My question is, what are some important things or dates young people should know about the next coming elections?
June 25th, primary, April 2nd, presidential primary.
Well, the presidential primary is going to be on the same day that this first appears. Primaries used to be in September for the legislature and the council, but they had to move them earlier in order to give time for military ballots in order to get back. There was a federal case over that. So we're going to move out of the presidential attention, at least on New York State, and move into the level of this year electing. There's a special congressional election in upstate in Buffalo for a congressman who retired, and then we have the general, you know, all 27 or whatever we have left. We had 45 when I was a kid, you know, congressional seats when we were the largest state in the country, population-wise, and the entire legislature is going to be up, and we have the constitutional amendments. So that. And you do have time to register. I mean, you
have a lot of time to register.
Yeah.
What you might not have time to do is the party affiliation.
Change your party.
You know, that's something that I think a lot of folks, if you already, like, you know, as folks know, like, we have closed primaries here, you know, so you have to be registered or affiliated with a specific party to be able to cast your ballot. And, you know, that is relatively early for New York State. I think, like, you know, maybe another thing that we could address as well.
Well, the other option was to have it in August when people were all.
The biggest vacation month. But yes, the dates, how early early voting, you should keep track. There's always 10 days before, the day before election, that Monday. It's never, Sunday's always the last day.
Except for this cycle.
Except for this,
presidential.
You should keep track of voter registration, be at least 10 days before, but you have to have lived here at least 30 days before. So if you push enough, get your elected officials, get behind them, maybe they'll have same day registration, automatic voter registration, you know, part of that extension of motor voter.
But you do have, you know, in particular, the 2020 election, the election deniers think that making it easier to vote is bad for Republicans.
Yeah.
And so there's been, not in New York, but across the country, there's been this tremendous
Pushback.
Tremendous revolt against we only have 2 minutes left, but you know, I just want to touch on this question of civic consciousness, and the ability of students to understand, in particular, something broader than the fact that they too live in a bubble. You know, we all live in our bubbles. You know, as I was a reporter for many years, and there's a big difference between being skeptical, which you should be, and being cynical, which is destructive, saying they're all a bunch of bums, I don't want to have anything to do with them. I mean, there's a big, you know, and I'm not pulling rank because I'm old now. I mean, been there, done that.
I think it's important for the youth to understand that we do have a responsibility. We have a responsibility to this country and we have a responsibility for the people around us. Voting or not voting, it is a choice that will ultimately affect you, your family, your neighbors, and everybody else. So it's important at some point to step out of that bubble you're talking about and really look at the bigger picture. I think we are on earth for a reason. We have rights, and sometimes it is our duty to exercise our rights, because if we don't do it, something is going to happen that we may never register that this happened because we didn't make the choice to go vote, but ultimately that one vote does matter. And it's important for us to build that bigger picture vision. I know that life is hard, things happen, things are messy, a lot of things are upsetting, they are traumatizing for where we are right now today, but we shouldn't let this cloud us for the bigger environment in which we are in. It's a big ecosystem and we all have a role, and I think that elections, voting is the best manifestation of this role. It is, I think, a moral imperative to do that.
I have 5 seconds left. I'm actually going to make deadline. Thank you all for joining us on CUNY Forum, and we'll see you next time.
Thank
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.